The glass slipped from the CEO's hand and shattered across the marble floor the moment her father heard the single dad's name. For nearly an hour, everyone at the company party had watched Vivian Caldwell laugh at a tired mechanic in a faded suit, never imagining that the man she considered an embarrassment was connected to the darkest and most painful chapter of her family's history. But when her father turned pale and whispered, "Where did you hear that name?" the entire room fell silent. Before we continue, if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who believes people deserve to be judged by their hearts, and subscribe to our channel so our community can continue sharing stories that remind us what truly matters. The party was being held in the bright glass atrium of Caldwell Dynamics, where sunlight poured through enormous windows and reflected from polished floors, expensive watches, and crystal decorations. Vivian had organized the celebration to mark the company's most successful year in its history. She was 38, brilliant, disciplined, and intimidating, the kind of CEO who could walk into a boardroom and make a dozen executives sit straighter without saying a word. She had built her reputation by believing that weakness was something people created for themselves. Her father, Everett Caldwell, had founded the company decades earlier, but Vivian had transformed it into a global engineering corporation. She wore an elegant navy dress and moved through the crowd with effortless confidence, greeting investors and executives while servers carried trays of food beneath a ceiling filled with hanging lights. Then a quiet man entered through the employee entrance. His name was Graham Mercer. He was 41, a single father, and the owner of a small neighborhood auto repair shop that had recently begun servicing Caldwell Dynamics company vehicles. His suit was clean but obviously old, his shoes had been polished by hand, and his left sleeve had been repaired near the cuff. He had brought his 12-year-old daughter, Elsie, because his usual babysitter had cancelled and he had no family nearby. Elsie stood beside him in a simple blue dress, holding his hand tightly while looking around at a world that seemed impossibly wealthy compared with their modest life. Graham had not wanted to attend. He had only come because his shop had completed emergency repairs on 6 company vehicles in less than a week, and Vivian's operations director had insisted that he be included in the employee appreciation celebration. Graham had spent years learning not to feel ashamed of what he could not afford. He had learned that a person could wear a $10 shirt and still have a $1,000 heart. His daughter had learned the same lesson from him. When they entered the atrium, Elsie stared at the enormous floral arrangement and whispered that she had never seen so many flowers in one place. Graham smiled and told her to enjoy herself, because beautiful things did not belong only to rich people. Unfortunately, Vivian overheard him. She turned toward them with a polite smile that quickly disappeared when she noticed his worn suit and grease-stained fingernails. She recognized him as the mechanic who had argued with her transportation department about unsafe brakes on one of the company vans. Instead of greeting him warmly, she looked him up and down and asked whether he had accidentally wandered into the wrong event. Several executives nearby laughed nervously. Graham remained calm, but Elsie immediately moved closer to her father. Vivian continued, making a joke about how the company was apparently inviting everyone these days, including people who normally spent their working hours underneath cars. Graham looked at her and simply said that he had been invited. That answer should have ended the conversation, but Vivian was surrounded by people who constantly praised her, and she had grown accustomed to being the most powerful person in every room. She asked Graham whether he had come hoping to impress someone with his mechanic stories. Graham said he had only come because his work had been requested and because he wanted his daughter to see where the vehicles she helped repair belonged. Vivian smiled coldly and said that perhaps next year they would provide a special award for changing oil. The laughter around them grew louder. Elsie's eyes filled with tears, but Graham squeezed her hand and quietly told her that they should not let someone else's arrogance determine their worth. What Vivian did not know was that Graham had not always been a mechanic. 15 years earlier, he had been one of the most promising young engineers in the country. He had worked on advanced vehicle safety systems and had once been recruited by Caldwell Dynamics itself. His career had ended abruptly after a catastrophic prototype accident injured 2 workers and caused the company to lose millions. Graham had taken responsibility for a design flaw that he believed was partly his fault, even though he had repeatedly warned senior executives about the problem. He resigned before anyone could fire him, and he disappeared from the corporate world. He married his college sweetheart, Marissa, and tried to rebuild his life. Years later, Marissa died unexpectedly, leaving Graham to raise Elsie alone. He never returned to engineering because he could not bear the thought of another mistake costing someone their life. Instead, he opened a small repair shop and spent his days fixing ordinary people's cars, often charging less than he should because he knew what it felt like to choose between a repair bill and groceries. As Vivian walked away, Graham noticed an older man standing near the far end of the atrium. Everett Caldwell had been listening. He was 72, respected throughout the industry, and usually known for his calm smile. But the moment he heard Graham's name, that smile vanished. He stared at the single father as though he had seen a ghost. Everett slowly walked toward him, ignoring everyone around him. When he reached Graham, his voice trembled as he asked whether he was Graham Mercer. Graham nodded. Everett's face drained of color. He asked if Graham had once worked on the Falcon safety project. Graham hesitated before admitting that he had. Everett looked as though the air had disappeared from the room. He asked whether Graham remembered a young engineer named Thomas Vale who had worked beside him. Graham said yes. Thomas had been his closest friend and the lead engineer on the prototype. Everett closed his eyes for a moment and whispered that he had been searching for Graham for 14 years. Vivian watched in confusion. She had never heard her father speak Graham's name before, yet something in Everett's expression frightened her. He asked Graham why he had never contacted him after the accident. Graham answered that he had tried. He had written letters, left messages, and even visited the company headquarters, but every attempt had been blocked by the legal department. Everett looked stunned. He said he had never received a single message. Graham explained that after the accident, he had believed Everett had chosen the company over him. Everett shook his head and said he had believed Graham had abandoned everyone. The two men stared at each other as 14 years of misunderstanding suddenly stood between them. Vivian stepped closer and asked her father what was happening. Everett looked at her with disappointment. He told her that Graham was the engineer who had warned the company about the prototype's braking system. He explained that Graham had submitted 3 written reports stating that the system could fail under extreme temperature changes. The senior leadership team had dismissed those warnings because delaying production would cost millions. When the prototype failed, the blame had fallen on Graham because he had been the youngest engineer attached to the project. Thomas Vale, Graham's closest friend, had tried to defend him and had discovered internal documents proving that senior executives had ignored the safety reports. Before Thomas could expose them, he was pressured into silence and eventually left the company. Everett had learned the truth years later, but by then Graham had vanished. Vivian stared at Graham, unable to reconcile the man she had mocked with the engineer her father described. She asked why he had never defended himself publicly. Graham looked at Elsie before answering that he had been tired of fighting people who only cared about protecting a company's reputation. He had lost his career, his best friend, and eventually the life he had imagined with Marissa. He had decided that proving himself was no longer important. Being a good father was. He said he could live with people thinking he was a mechanic with an old suit, because his daughter knew who he really was. Elsie quietly slipped her hand into his. Everett's eyes filled with tears. Then came the second revelation. Everett told everyone that the accident had never been caused by Graham's design. The original safety reports had been altered before being presented to the board. Someone had removed the warnings about the temperature failure. Everett had spent years trying to uncover who had done it, but the executive responsible had already retired and died before the investigation was completed. The truth had been buried under legal settlements and corporate restructuring. Graham had carried guilt for 14 years over something he had never caused. Vivian looked devastated. The woman who had spent years believing strength meant never showing weakness suddenly realized that her own arrogance had nearly repeated the same cruelty her father had spent years regretting. She walked toward Graham and apologized. Not the polished apology of a CEO protecting her reputation, but the broken apology of a woman who finally understood what she had done. She admitted that she had judged him by his clothes, his job, and his financial situation. She admitted that she had laughed because everyone around her laughed, and that she had forgotten how humiliating it felt to be treated as though you did not belong. Graham listened without interrupting. He did not forgive her immediately. He simply told her that an apology meant little if it ended with words. If she truly wanted to make things right, she should make sure no employee, contractor, or family ever felt worthless because of their position. Vivian nodded. The next morning, she visited Graham's repair shop with Everett. She did not arrive in a company limousine or bring a photographer. She came in an ordinary car and spent the morning helping organize tools while Graham worked. She met customers who had trusted him for years, including elderly people who could not afford dealership prices and young workers who depended on their cars to keep their jobs. She watched Graham repair a brake system for a single mother and refused to charge her the full amount because he knew she was struggling. For the first time, Vivian understood that wealth and worth were not the same thing. Weeks later, Caldwell Dynamics announced a new safety initiative led by Graham. He was offered a senior engineering position, but he refused to abandon his repair shop. Instead, he accepted a role as an independent safety advisor, allowing him to continue serving ordinary customers while helping the company prevent the mistakes of the past. Vivian changed too. She began spending time with employees outside executive meetings. She stopped judging people by clothing, titles, or salaries. She created a scholarship in Thomas Vale's name for young engineers who spoke up about safety concerns, even when doing so was unpopular. Everett attended the first scholarship ceremony, sitting beside Graham and Elsie. At the ceremony, Elsie was asked what she had learned from everything that happened. She looked toward her father and said that sometimes people laugh at what they do not understand, but that a person should never let someone else's opinion make them forget who they are. Graham lowered his head, overcome with emotion. Everett placed a hand on his shoulder, finally able to offer the apology he had been trying to give for more than a decade. Vivian stood nearby with tears in her eyes, realizing that the greatest lesson her father had ever taught her was not about business. It was about people. Before the event ended, Graham found Vivian alone near the bright windows where the entire nightmare had begun. She thanked him for giving her the chance to change. Graham told her that forgiveness was not about pretending the hurt never happened. It was about deciding that the hurt would not control the future. Vivian promised that she would remember that every person entering her company carried a story she could not see. Graham smiled and told her that was all he had wanted her to understand. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. And before you go, leave a comment telling us this: have you ever been judged by your appearance, your job, or your circumstances, only to prove that your heart was worth far more than people imagined? Graham walked into that party believing he had nothing left to prove, but he walked out knowing that his past had never made him weak. It had made him compassionate. Vivian entered the room believing power meant standing above others, but she left understanding that true power is knowing when to kneel, apologize, and change. And Everett finally learned that sometimes the person you have been searching for is not hiding at all. Sometimes he is simply standing quietly in front of you, waiting for someone to finally hear his name.